Europe's history is often told through the grand narratives of kings, generals, and empires, but hidden beneath the familiar battles and revolutions are moments so strange, so secret, and so unexpected that they reshape the continent in ways few people remember. Some of these events are grotesque, some absurd, and some almost unbelievable, but all of them left their mark on the course of European history. Today, we are going to uncover five of these hidden turning points. Events that changed Europe forever, yet are rarely discussed in classrooms or textbooks. These are the forgotten threads of history, the tiny sparks that ignited massive fires, the unusual moments whose consequences stretched across centuries. Imagine a political dispute so tense that it ends with people being thrown out of a window. It sounds like the setup for a dark comedy, yet in Prague, 1618, it was reality. At this time, the Holy Roman Empire was not a unified state as we might imagine, but a sprawling patchwork of territories, principalities, and free cities, each with its own rulers, laws, and religious allegiances. Bohemia, the region we now call the Czech Republic, was one of these territories, and it was predominantly Protestant, governed by the Habsburgs, who were devout Catholics. Tensions had been simmering for decades. The Protestant nobility felt increasingly marginalized, their rights ignored, their religious freedoms restricted, and their political influence undermined by the Habsburg monarchy. Ordinary citizens were caught in the middle, often forced to conform to religious practices they did not believe in, pay taxes to support a system that excluded them, and witness their leaders bending the law to serve imperial interests. The emperor at the time, Ferdinand II, was young but determined, fiercely Catholic, and intent on consolidating his power across the empire. He sought to enforce religious uniformity and strengthen central authority, a move that would inevitably clash with the traditional autonomy of Bohemian nobles. The nobles, already alarmed by past abuses and violations of agreements like the Letter of Majesty, which guaranteed certain freedoms to Protestants, reached a breaking point. On May 23, 1618, tensions exploded. A group of Protestant nobles, led by Count Thurn, stormed Prague Castle in what would become one of the most infamous incidents in European history. Inside the castle, the imperial officials were unprepared. The confrontation escalated quickly. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and in a moment that would become legendary, the Protestants seized two royal governors and their secretary and threw them out of the third-story window of the castle. It sounds almost impossible, a grotesque, almost absurd image, but it happened. Remarkably, the officials survived the fall, landing in a pile of horse manure, which may have cushioned their descent. Yet the symbolic power of the act far outweighed the physical consequences. This moment, now known as the defenestration of Prague, was not merely an isolated incident of violence, it was a public declaration of defiance, a spark that would ignite a conflict of unprecedented scale. The defenestration did not happen in a vacuum. Europe at the time was a continent bristling with tension. Religious divisions between Protestants and Catholics were not just spiritual, they were political, economic, and cultural. Alliances were fragile, and grievances could easily escalate into war. In the case of Bohemia, the nobles' bold action against imperial authority signaled to other powers across Europe that the Habsburgs could be challenged. What began as a local protest quickly escalated into the 30 Years' War, a conflict that would engulf much of Central Europe for 30 years, leaving devastation in its wake. The war that followed was unlike anything Europe had seen. Armies moved across territories, laying waste to villages and cities. Famine, disease, and mass displacement became everyday realities for ordinary people. Germany, at the heart of the conflict, lost an estimated one-third of its population, a demographic catastrophe that reshaped entire regions. Economies collapsed under the weight of war, trade routes became perilous, and the political map of Central Europe was redrawn in ways that would influence European affairs for generations. Countries such as France and Sweden intervened, initially for religious solidarity, later for territorial and political advantage, turning what had begun as a Bohemian protest into a continental war. But it was not just the armies and politics that were affected. The social fabric of Central Europe changed irreversibly. Families were uprooted, communities destroyed, and centuries-old cultural and economic patterns disrupted. The psychological impact of the war left a generation scarred by violence, uncertainty, and displacement. This war, triggered by a single dramatic act of defiance, demonstrates a truth about history that is easy to overlook. Small, seemingly isolated events can have consequences that echo across nations and centuries. Yet the story of the defenestration of Prague is more than just political drama. It is also a human story of courage, desperation, and calculated risk. Count Thurn and the Protestant nobles were not reckless hooligans. They were strategically challenging an empire, using an act of dramatic symbolism to rally support and force attention to their grievances. The survival of the throne officials only heightened the legend, turning what could have been a simple assassination attempt into a historical moment remembered for centuries. It is remarkable to think that the political map of Europe, the outcomes of alliances, and the lives of millions were influenced by a single act of throwing men out of a window. In the decades that followed, Europe would see the consequences of this defiance unfold in full. Empires would rise and fall, territories would change hands, and religious tensions would continue to shape politics across the continent. The 30 Years' War would ultimately end with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which established principles of state sovereignty and religious tolerance that resonate to this day. And it all began with one bold, almost absurd act in a castle in Prague. The defenestration is a reminder that history is not only written by kings and generals, but also by those who dare to act decisively in moments of crisis, no matter how unusual or shocking their methods may seem. It was the morning of November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day, a day when Lisbon streets would normally have been filled with churchgoers, merchants, and families preparing to honor the departed. The city was alive with routine, its markets bustling, its harbors full of activity, and its grand churches filled with prayer and music. Portugal at the time was a prosperous empire. Its wealth flowed from colonies in Brazil, Africa, and Asia. Lisbon was a hub of trade, culture, and influence, admired across Europe for its architecture, art, and intellectual life. Citizens went about their routines with little thought that everything would soon change in an instant. Then the ground began to shake. At first, people thought it was a minor tremor, a normal occurrence in a city that sat near geological fault lines. But within moments, the tremors intensified, turning into a violent earthquake that lasted several minutes. Buildings, some centuries old, crumbled like sandcastles. Churches collapsed, killing hundreds who had come to pray. Merchants' stalls were thrown into chaos, their goods smashed and scattered. Panic spread through the streets as people scrambled for safety, only to find there was none. Those who fled to open squares were engulfed by the next horror. A massive tsunami swept through the harbor, drowning ships and sweeping unsuspecting townspeople into the churning waters. As if that were not enough, fires ignited across the city, consuming what remained of buildings that had survived the quake and tsunami. By the time the disaster ended, Lisbon had been transformed into a landscape of ruin. Tens of thousands were dead, although exact numbers remain unknown. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated. The city's iconic architecture, built over centuries, was reduced to rubble. Families lost homes, livelihoods, and loved ones. Survivors wandered through streets that were unrecognizable, confronting a reality that seemed more like a nightmare than history. But the Great Lisbon earthquake was more than a disaster of destruction. It shook the intellectual foundations of Europe itself. Philosophers, theologians, and scientists were forced to grapple with questions that had never seemed urgent before. How could an all-powerful, benevolent God allow such indiscriminate suffering? Voltaire, the French philosopher and writer, would later reference the catastrophe in his seminal work Candide, describing the horror and chaos he had learned about, and questioning blind faith and the idea that the world was inherently just. Thinkers across Europe debated not only the theological implications, but also what could be done to understand and prevent such disasters in the future. The earthquake also had practical consequences that extended far beyond philosophy. Urban planners and architects began considering the resilience of cities. Engineers experimented with new building designs, attempting to construct structures capable of withstanding seismic forces. Governments realized they could no longer ignore natural disasters. Policies were drafted to manage urban planning, emergency response, and public safety. The Lisbon earthquake is widely considered one of the first events that spurred modern ideas about disaster management and civil engineering. The social and economic impacts were equally profound. Portugal's economy, already dependent on trade from overseas colonies, was severely weakened. Ships that carried gold, spices, and other resources from Brazil were delayed or destroyed. Merchants lost their inventories, and trade routes were disrupted across Europe. Other nations, recognizing Portugal's sudden vulnerability, moved to fill economic and political gaps. France, Britain, and the Netherlands all adjusted their strategies in the Atlantic, subtly shifting the balance of power. In other words, a single natural disaster had not only destroyed a city, but had also altered the political and economic landscape of Europe. For the people of Lisbon, survival was only the beginning. Entire communities had to be rebuilt from scratch. Churches, palaces, and public buildings were reconstructed with new architectural designs intended to prevent similar destruction in the future. New laws were enacted to regulate building standards, and a sense of shared vulnerability influenced the way the Portuguese approached urban governance. The earthquake also left psychological scars on survivors. Those who had witnessed family members swept away by the tsunami or trapped in collapsing buildings carried trauma for the rest of their lives. These stories spread across Europe through letters, newspapers, and the accounts of travelers, inspiring both fear and curiosity in those who had never witnessed such devastation firsthand. The Great Lisbon earthquake also influenced art, literature, and philosophy in subtle ways. Painters depicted the chaos and destruction, creating images that communicated both terror and awe. Writers used the earthquake as a metaphor for the unpredictability of life, the fragility of human endeavors, and the limitations of human reason. Philosophers argued that the disaster demonstrated the need for rational thought, science, and planning, rather than reliance on divine intervention alone. Some even proposed that human beings must accept the possibility of misfortune and build societies capable of resilience. Interestingly, the Lisbon earthquake also contributed indirectly to the rise of Enlightenment thinking in Europe. Scholars debated not only the causes of natural disasters, but also the nature of society, governance, and human responsibility. Could governments anticipate disasters? Could science and planning reduce the human cost of catastrophe? Could philosophy provide comfort or guidance when the world seemed so arbitrary? The event became a case study in risk, reason, and the fragility of civilization. Even today, the 1755 earthquake is remembered not just as a geological event, but as a turning point in European thought. It reminds us that history is not always shaped by wars, kings, or treaties. Sometimes nature intervenes, forcing entire societies to adapt, rethink, and evolve. One morning in Lisbon, the ground shook, the sea rose, and fire consumed the city. Yet from this catastrophe emerged new ideas, new structures, and new philosophies that would influence Europe for decades to come. The earthquake also had personal stories woven into the larger catastrophe. Survivors recalled miraculous escapes, such as families who fled to hilltops just in time to avoid the tsunami, or merchants who had hidden treasures in cellars that withstood the shaking. There were tales of priests who stayed to comfort the dying, chroniclers who documented every detail, and common citizens whose lives were irreversibly altered. These narratives became part of the European consciousness, carried through letters, books, and oral history, reinforcing the sense that the world was fragile and that every individual's life was intertwined with forces far greater than themselves. The Great Lisbon earthquake of 1755 is a stark reminder that even in a continent shaped by armies, politics, and religion, nature has the power to rewrite history. One day, a city of wealth and culture, thriving in trade and prosperity, was transformed into rubble and despair. But in its aftermath, new ideas, philosophies, and systems emerged that helped Europe understand, adapt, and survive. In a strange way, the disasters seeded the future, shaping not only Portugal but the intellectual and social currents of all Europe. In 897, the papacy, one of the most powerful and influential institutions in Europe, became the stage for one of the strangest, most shocking events in recorded history. The story is so bizarre it seems more like a tale from a dark legend than reality, yet it truly happened. This event would be remembered for centuries as the Cadaver Synod, a trial unlike any other in human history, in which a dead pope was literally put on trial. To understand the Cadaver Synod, we must first understand the turbulent context of the time. The papacy was not simply a spiritual office, it was a political powerhouse. Popes influenced kings and emperors, controlled vast lands, and wielded enormous authority over the people of Europe. However, the papacy in the late 9th century was plagued by factionalism, corruption, and intense rivalries. Nobles, clergy, and foreign powers constantly vied to install a pope who would favor their interests, and the office had become a prize for political maneuvering rather than purely spiritual leadership. Pope Formosus had served the Church from 891 to 896. During his tenure, he faced significant challenges, including territorial disputes in Italy and conflicts over imperial coronation rights. Formosus's actions, particularly his involvement in crowning a rival emperor, angered many powerful factions within the Church. His enemies bided their time, waiting for the opportunity to exact revenge. Formosus died in April 896, seemingly closing the chapter on his turbulent papacy, but the story was far from over. Enter Pope Stephen VI, a man determined to consolidate his power and punish his predecessor. Whether motivated by genuine outrage, political calculation, or personal vendetta, Stephen conceived a plan so shocking that it would become legendary. He would put the dead body of Pope Formosus on trial. The corpse was exhumed from its tomb, dressed in full papal vestments, and seated on a throne in a public courtroom. Witnesses were called to testify against the body, accusations were read aloud, and the corpse was, in effect, tried for alleged violations during its papacy. The grotesque nature of the event is almost unimaginable. Clerics argued with the corpse, pointing fingers and recounting supposed crimes. Stephen presided over the trial with the authority of the living, but the symbolism was macabre. A man who once held divine authority was now judged in death, his rotting flesh a silent testament to mortality and the fragility of power. The Cadaver Synod was not merely a theatrical spectacle, it was a deliberate political maneuver to invalidate Formosus' decisions, delegitimize his allies, and send a message to anyone who might oppose Stephen's authority. Ultimately, the corpse was found guilty. The verdict was brutal in its symbolism. Formosus' papal vestments were stripped away, his consecrated rings removed, and his body was desecrated. The corpse was thrown into the Tiber River, though accounts vary on whether it was later retrieved and reburied. The consequences were immediate and profound. Rome erupted into chaos. Citizens and clergy were horrified, and the scandal undermined confidence in the papacy itself. Factions that had supported Formosus rose in protest, while others who had backed Stephen soon feared his erratic behavior and ruthless tactics. The political fallout of the Cadaver Synod was long-lasting. Stephen VI himself was eventually imprisoned and strangled, a grim reflection of the volatile and violent nature of papal politics at the time. Subsequent popes annulled the verdict of the synod, restored Formosus' legacy, and attempted to restore order to a fractured church. Yet the damage had been done. The Cadaver Synod had exposed the fragility of one of Europe's most important institutions, showing that personal vendettas, factional rivalry, and the lust for power could literally manipulate life, death, and faith. But beyond politics, the Cadaver Synod also left a lasting cultural and psychological imprint on Europe. The grotesque spectacle became a cautionary tale, a story recounted in chronicles and letters, warning future generations about the dangers of unchecked ambition, revenge, and corruption. Artists and writers would reference the event for centuries, using it as a symbol of moral decay, the absurdity of political extremes, and the vulnerability of human institutions. The Synod also influenced the way the papacy was perceived by ordinary people. For many, the Pope was no longer an untouchable spiritual authority. He was a human figure, subject to manipulation, error, and the same petty rivalries that afflicted ordinary society. The Cadaver Synod reminds us that history is not always rational, it is not always fair, it is not always noble. Sometimes history is grotesque, absurd, and almost incomprehensible. Yet the consequences of such events are very real. By destabilizing the papacy, the Synod altered the balance of power in Italy, influenced imperial politics across Europe, and forced a reconsideration of ecclesiastical law and governance. Entire decades of church policy, succession, and authority were impacted by a single horrifying spectacle, a corpse on trial. And while the Cadaver Synod seems grotesque to modern eyes, it is also a story about human psychology, symbolism, and the lengths people will go to assert control. The act of judging a corpse was not merely revenge, it was a public assertion of authority, a spectacle designed to intimidate allies and enemies alike. In that sense, it is a reminder that in history, ideas, perception, and symbolism can be just as powerful as armies, laws, or armies of bureaucrats. The story of the Cadaver Synod also provides insight into the precarious nature of power in medieval Europe. Nobles, clergy, and monarchs constantly negotiated authority through force, manipulation, and spectacle. Every decision, every act of defiance had potential consequences that could ripple across generations. In a world where political stability was fragile, even a corpse could become a weapon, a tool, or a symbol. Thus, the Cadaver Synod stands not merely as an anecdote of horror, but as a pivotal event that reshaped the Church, influenced European politics, and left a legacy of cautionary lessons. It is a reminder that history is never entirely predictable, that power is often volatile, and that sometimes the most shocking events have the deepest consequences. The trial of a dead pope is a story so bizarre that it challenges our understanding of human behavior, yet it also demonstrates how single, secret, or overlooked events can shape the destiny of nations. In the summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg, part of the Holy Roman Empire, experienced an event so bizarre, so inexplicable, that it continues to fascinate historians, psychologists, and the public to this day. It began, as these things often do, with one person. A woman named Frau Trophäa began dancing in the streets. At first it seemed harmless enough, a curious display, perhaps a personal expression of joy or religious fervor. But soon it became something else entirely. She could not stop. Day after day, Frau Trophäa danced, seemingly overcome by an uncontrollable force, her movements relentless, her body racked by exhaustion. Within a week, others joined her. Dozens of citizens, men and women alike, found themselves dancing in the streets, unable to resist the compulsion. By the end of the month, the number had grown into the hundreds. People danced for days without rest, collapsing from fatigue, dehydration, and in some cases, death. The city was gripped by panic. Streets once filled with markets, tradesmen, and daily life were now dominated by relentless, unceasing movement. The citizens of Strasbourg watched in horror as neighbors, friends, and strangers danced themselves into oblivion. The causes of the phenomenon remain mysterious to this day. Modern historians have proposed several theories. Some suggest mass hysteria, driven by stress, famine, and disease, as a collective psychological response to extreme conditions. Others point to ergot poisoning, caused by a hallucinogenic mold that can grow on damp rye, potentially triggering convulsions and hallucinations. Religious explanations were also common at the time, with citizens interpreting the dancing as a curse, divine punishment, or the work of evil spirits. Whatever the cause, the results were unmistakable: chaos, exhaustion, and death. City authorities were bewildered. Initial attempts to control the situation only made matters worse. Some leaders encouraged the dancing, believing that allowing the afflicted to dance would dance out the compulsion and free them from the curse. Musicians were hired to accompany the dancers, public squares were cleared, and yet the phenomenon persisted. People fell unconscious mid-step, only to resume dancing once they recovered. Families were torn apart as parents watched children and loved ones dance themselves into dangerous exhaustion. It was unlike anything the city had ever experienced. The dancing plague had profound social consequences. Markets were disrupted, trade slowed, and normal civic life ground to a halt. Physicians were called in, offering remedies based on the medical understanding of the time, including bloodletting, charms, and religious rituals. Priests held processions, urging divine intervention and public penance. But rational solutions were elusive as the city struggled to understand the unexplainable. Strasbourg became a cautionary tale for neighboring cities and territories. For historians, the dancing plague also provides insight into the social and cultural pressures of the time. The early 16th century was a period of hardship in Europe. Crop failures, disease, economic instability, and religious tension created a climate of stress and anxiety. Psychologists suggest that the collective stress, combined with cultural and religious beliefs, may have manifested in this extraordinary physical expression, the compulsion to dance. The phenomenon illustrates how human societies, under pressure, can exhibit extreme and unexpected behaviors. Beyond the immediate chaos, the dancing plague left lasting impacts. The authorities of Strasbourg were forced to reconsider their approach to public health, urban planning, and crisis management. Lessons were learned about the limits of social control, the dangers of mass hysteria, and the need for careful observation and intervention in public health crises. Though the phenomenon itself vanished after several weeks, its memory endured, chronicled in city records and accounts that would be referenced for centuries. The event also influenced European thought about psychology, the human body, and collective behavior. Physicians and scholars debated whether the dancers were victims of a medical condition, divine punishment, or psychological stress. These debates contributed indirectly to the early study of mental health and psychosomatic disorders. Even in art and literature, the dancing plague became a symbol of the mysterious and uncontrollable forces that can grip society, a metaphor for both human vulnerability and the thin line between order and chaos. Stories from the dancing plague are both tragic and mesmerizing. Chroniclers describe scenes of exhaustion and collapse, of families pleading for intervention, and of city officials oscillating between encouragement, punishment, and despair. Some dancers reportedly died on the streets, while others survived only to carry the memory and trauma of the event for the rest of their lives. Witnesses reported the eerie rhythm of hundreds of bodies moving in unison, the relentless beat of feet on cobblestones, and the sense of inevitability that anyone could succumb to the compulsion at any moment. For modern audiences, the dancing plague challenges our assumptions about historical reality. It shows that history is not always dictated by kings, generals, or laws. Sometimes inexplicable, chaotic events ripple through society, leaving impacts that are psychological, social, and cultural. Strasbourg's dancing epidemic is a reminder that Europe's history is shaped not only by wars and treaties, but also by human vulnerability, collective stress, and the mysterious forces that can emerge under extraordinary conditions. In the end, the dancing plague demonstrates a profound truth. History is rarely rational. Events that seem absurd or unexplainable at first glance can carry consequences that extend far beyond their immediate moment. Cities must adapt, governments must respond, and societies are forced to confront the limits of control and understanding. Strasbourg, 1518, is an extraordinary example of this principle. One woman begins to dance, then dozens join, then hundreds. And in the streets, ordinary life dissolves into chaos, leaving lessons for centuries to come about resilience, human psychology, and the unpredictable nature of history itself. History is often shaped not only by wars, disasters, and grotesque spectacles, but also by the smallest, most personal events, moments of chance that alter the trajectory of an individual and, in turn, the fate of entire nations. One such moment occurred on the rocky island of Corsica in the early 1760s, with the near kidnapping of a young boy named Napoleon Bonaparte. Though he was just a child at the time, his survival would eventually influence the course of European history for decades to come. Napoleon was born in 1769 into a minor noble family in Ajaccio, Corsica, shortly after France had seized control of the island from Genoa. His family's position placed them in the midst of local political tensions. Corsica, newly annexed by France, was a place of unrest. Local resistance fighters, angry at French control, had attempted to assert authority through rebellion and intimidation. The Bonaparte family, loyal to French rule, found themselves targeted by insurgents. One of the plots against them involved kidnapping young Napoleon, a boy barely old enough to understand the stakes, and using him as leverage against his family. The details of the kidnapping plot remain obscure, but it is clear that the event could have changed the course of history entirely. Had Napoleon been captured, his education, social connections, and future opportunities would have been severely disrupted, if not entirely eliminated. Corsican rebels would have used him as a bargaining chip, potentially removing him from the French sphere of influence. In that alternate history, the Napoleonic Wars, wars that would reshape Europe's borders, influence politics, and alter the destinies of millions, may never have occurred. The map of Europe could have looked completely different. Napoleon's survival, however, allowed him to continue his education, first on Corsica and later on the European continent. He attended military school in mainland France, excelling in mathematics, history, and strategy. His brilliance in understanding logistics, leadership, and tactics became apparent even in his teenage years. The young boy who had narrowly escaped death on a small Mediterranean island would grow into the man who would command armies across Europe, confront empires, and leave an indelible mark on the continent. Napoleon's rise was meteoric. By the age of 24, he was a general in the French army. By 30, he had become first consul of France and later emperor. His campaigns reshaped Europe, redrawing borders from Spain to Italy, Austria to Prussia. Legal systems, administrative structures, and military doctrines were influenced by his vision. In France, he implemented reforms that persist to this day, including the Napoleonic Code, which modernized civil law and influenced legal systems far beyond Europe. All of this was contingent in some way on a single, nearly forgotten event: the survival of a child in Corsica. Napoleon's life is a testament to the profound consequences of small, secret, or overlooked moments in history. A near kidnapping, a family's vigilance, and sheer chance combined to allow a single individual to grow into one of Europe's most influential figures. His story reminds us that history is not predetermined. It is shaped by the unpredictable, the contingent, and the often unseen events that create the conditions for greatness or disaster. Taken together, the 5 secret events we have explored, the defenestration of Prague, the Great Lisbon Earthquake, the Cadaver Synod, the Dancing Plague of Strasbourg, and young Napoleon's near kidnapping, illustrate a central truth about European history. History is not only a chronicle of battles, treaties, and monarchs, it is also shaped by chance, by the grotesque, by the bizarre, and by the often overlooked threads that connect individual lives to the broader sweep of time. These events reveal that the course of history is fragile, unpredictable, and often astonishing. A thrown man in Prague ignited a continent-wide war. An earthquake in Lisbon reshaped philosophy, urban planning, and political power. A corpse on trial exposed the fragility of institutions and the extremity of human ambition. Uncontrolled dancers in Strasbourg revealed the mysterious and chaotic side of human society, and the survival of a single child, a boy named Napoleon, redirected the destinies of nations. Each of these events in its own way demonstrates that history is a web of cause and effect, woven from both the monumental and the seemingly trivial. Perhaps the most profound lesson we can draw from these stories is that history is not inevitable. It is contingent on human choices, chance occurrences, and even the whims of nature. It is influenced by the actions of individuals, by disasters, and by events that, at first glance, may appear absurd, grotesque, or insignificant. And yet, each of these moments has left a legacy influencing politics, society, culture, and the world we live in today. As we reflect on these hidden events, we can also consider our own role in history. Small actions, bold decisions, and unforeseen consequences can shape the lives of others in ways that are impossible to predict. The past is not just a series of dates and facts, it is a tapestry of interconnected moments, choices, and events, some remembered, some forgotten, all powerful in shaping the present and future. In conclusion, the secret events we have explored remind us to look beyond the familiar narratives of history. They teach us that Europe's past is filled with mysteries, surprises, and shocks, events that are sometimes bizarre, often overlooked, but always consequential. From Prague to Lisbon, Rome to Strasbourg, and from Corsica to the heights of empire, these moments demonstrate the fragile, contingent, and astonishing nature of history itself. So the next time you think of European history as a straightforward story of kings and battles, remember these hidden episodes. Remember the men thrown from windows, the city swallowed by earth and fire, the corpse tried for its alleged crimes, the dancers who could not stop, and the boy whose survival changed the continent. History, in its truest form, is strange, unpredictable, and endlessly fascinating, and it is shaped not only by the great and the powerful, but also by the secret, the hidden, and the almost unbelievable events that continue to reverberate through time.